All right, let's dive into this deep dive all about foraging. We know you're super into edible wild plants lately, so we figured, hey, why not explore that a bit more, right?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff.
So to get started, we looked at a bunch of sources. There's 100+ wild edible plants to forage on the Practical Self-Reliance blog. There's this one called Don't Touch These Plants from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Sounds kind of scary, actually.
Oh, yeah, that one's important. Safety first, always.
Right. We also checked out edible wild plants from the Art of Manliness website, the Foragers Beware blog, and even something from the Philadelphia Orchard Project called, Intro to Wild Edibles.
Wow, that's quite a spread.
Yeah, and just skimming the sheer variety of plants you can actually eat is pretty mind-blowing. I mean, it's like real-life Pokemon Go, but for food.
I love that analogy.
Hey.
And it's so true. There's this incredible diversity out there. But, before we get too carried away dreaming of wild berry pies and all.
Oh, yeah, those warnings, right?
Exactly. Safety first. All of our sources, especially that Foragers Beware blog, were really adamant about being absolutely 100% certain about what you're picking.
Yeah, that blog was intense. Like, no sugarcoating whatsoever.
Well, they have a good point. Misidentifying a plant, even just touching the wrong one, can have some seriously nasty consequences.
Oh, for sure. Like, what kind of consequences are we talking about here?
Well, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service article, the Don't Touch These Plants, one specifically mentioned giant hogweed, cow parsnip, and wild parsnip as plants to avoid at all costs. Apparently, even brushing against them can cause severe skin reactions.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember reading about those. Some people get horrible burns and blisters, right?
Yeah, and it can even lead to scarring and, in some cases, even blindness.
Yikes. Okay, that makes the whole trading office hazards for ticks comment from the Practical Self-Reliance blog seem pretty tame.
Haha, right. I mean, every activity has its risks, but when it comes to foraging, caution is definitely key.
Yeah. Noted. So, assuming we're being super careful and all, where do we even begin with this whole foraging thing? What kind of cool stuff is out there waiting to be discovered?
Well, that Practical Self-Reliance blog, the one with the massive list, was pretty eye-opening. Even just the nut section was amazing. Did you know that butternuts and hickory nuts store incredibly well?
Oh, that's interesting. I never really thought about how foraging could help you, eat seasonally, like having those nuts stored away for winter when fresh stuff is scarce.
Exactly. And they're packed with protein and healthy fats, perfect for those cold months. But it's not just about practicality. There's some seriously unique stuff out there, too. Have you ever heard of, say, autumn olive, service berries, or Solomon's plume?
I can't say those are ringing any bells.
Yeah.
Definitely sounds a lot more exotic than the usual dandelions and berries I picture when I think about foraging.
Oh, absolutely. And those are just a few examples. A Practical Self-Reliance blog even had a picture showing just how much Solomon's plume they found in one spot. It was crazy.
Okay, you've piqued my curiosity. What else is on this forager's treasure map?
Well, the root section is full of surprises, too. Beyond the common dock, you've got things like sunchokes with a kind of nutty flavor, and Indian cucumber root, which apparently tastes, well, like cucumber.
I'm already getting hungry just thinking about all this. So what about water? Can you forage in or near water?
Absolutely. They had a whole section on aquatic plants of the Practical Self-Reliance blog. There's arrowhead, which is also called duck potato. What a fun name, right?
Yeah. Duck potato, that's awesome.
And then there are cattails, which you've probably seen a million times, but maybe never thought of as food. Oh, and of course, if you're lucky enough to be near the right kind of water, there's wild rice too.
Ooh, wild rice pancakes.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm seeing how foraging can really connect you to the natural world, It's like you're actually interacting with your environment on a different level.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the abundance all around us and appreciating the role these plants play in the ecosystem. And speaking of which, we can't forget about sea vegetables.
Like seaweed. I've always been curious about that, but I have to admit, it's a bit outside my comfort zone.
It's definitely an area ripe for exploration. The Practical Self-Reliance blog mentioned dulse and Irish moss, but they even put out a call for more info from coastal foragers. So what about you? Are you near the coast? Have you ever encountered any edible seaweed?
Me? Nah, I'm landlocked. But hey, that's a great question for our listeners who are near the coast. Maybe they can share their experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about sharing knowledge and learning from each other. But the culinary adventure doesn't stop at the water's edge. Practical Self-Reliance also covers wild spices, things like spice bush and wood avens, which apparently have incredibly unique flavors.
Wow, wild spices. I never knew you could find spices in the wild. That's pretty cool.
It is. And they even talked about the subtle differences between spruce tips and fir tips, which I found fascinating. It's those little details, you know?
Yeah, totally. So we've got nuts, fruits, roots, aquatic plants, and even spices. What else could there possibly be?
Well, how about grains? Did you know there could be over 200 edible wild seed species on the West Coast alone? The blog highlighted goosefoot seeds, which, get this, have a connection to bog bodies.
Bog bodies. Okay, now you have to tell me more about that.
So goosefoot seeds were actually found in the stomach of a bog body dating back to like 300 BC. It's just incredible to think that humans have been utilizing these wild grains for so long.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. And over 200 edible seed species? That's crazy. Okay, so what about pine pollen?
Pine pollen? You mean that yellow dust that coats everything every spring?
Yeah, that's the one. It's more of a nuisance than anything else, I'd say.
Well, believe it or not, that pesky pollen is actually packed with nutrients. You can sprinkle it on yogurt, add it to smoothies, even use it as a flour substitute.
No way. I've been battling this stuff for years, and I could have been eating it this whole time. Pine pollen is definitely going on my foraging list now.
Uh-huh. I'm glad to hear it. Now, we've talked about a lot of different plant varieties, but what about mushrooms?
Oh, mushrooms. That's one area of foraging I'm pretty intimidated by. How do you even know which ones are safe to eat? It seems so risky.
You're right to be cautious with mushrooms. The Practical Self-Reliance blog recommends starting with the easier-to-identify species, like morels, chanterelles, and puffballs. But a good field guide and maybe even some expert advice are crucial. Don't just rely on online sources for mushroom identification.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even experienced foragers need to be extra careful with mushrooms.
Absolutely. But here's something I bet you didn't know. You can actually forage for mushrooms in the winter. Some species actually thrive in the cold.
Winter foraging? Wow, that sounds like a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
It is. But before we get ahead of ourselves, there's one more category from Practical Self-Reliance we need to touch on. Lichens.
Lichens? I honestly didn't even know those were edible.
Technically some are, but it's more of a, let's say, survival food situation. They mentioned Usnea as an example and even joked that just because you can eat something doesn't mean you'll actually want to.
That's hilarious. Okay, that's fair. Some wild edibles are definitely more appealing than others, I guess.
Right. But hey, we've spent quite a bit of time on Practical Self-Reliance now. What about those other sources? What kind of insights did they offer?
That's a great question. Let's dive into those next. So we've explored all these amazing edible plants, but I have to admit it's a bit overwhelming. Like, where do we even begin if we actually want to, try this foraging thing?
Yeah, I get it. It could be a lot to take in. But don't worry, we've got you covered. That edible wild plants article from Art of Manliness actually had some really practical advice, even some surprising stuff about common plants.
Really? Like what?
Well, for example, did you know wild asparagus is much thinner than the asparagus you buy at the grocery store?
I didn't actually. Does it, taste different too?
Apparently, it's way more intense, a much stronger, earthier flavor. And it's even higher in vitamin C than the cultivated kind.
Huh. See, there's always something new to learn. What else did this article talk about?
Well, they mentioned burdock, which is actually a popular food in Japan. You can eat the leaves, the stalks, even the root is edible after a bit of prep work.
Burdock. Wow, I've heard of it, but I never knew it was something you could forage for. What kind of dishes do they make with it in Japan? I'm curious.
Well, that's a great question. It's used in a lot of different things, stir fries, soups, even tempura. There's a traditional Japanese dish called kinpura gobo, which is basically a stir fry of burdock root and carrots.
Oh, wow, that sounds delicious. I'm starting to see how foraging opens up this whole new world of, culinary possibilities.
Exactly. And the Art of Manliness article also talked about chicory, which is cool because you can eat the whole plant. Young leaves, raw or cooked. The root can be roasted and ground as a coffee substitute. Even the flowers are edible.
Wow, talk about versatile. Okay, so we've got asparagus, burdock, chicory. What other gems did they unearth?
Well, they went beyond land-based foraging, too, and mentioned seaweed, specifically how important it can be as a survival food. Green seaweed, for instance, can be used in soups or even to make DIY sushi.
Seaweed sushi, that's something I'd definitely try. It's like taking foraging from the forest to the sea.
Exactly. It's about realizing how resourceful you can be when you have this knowledge. And speaking of nutrient-rich sea vegetables, they also mentioned kelp. Great source of folate and vitamin K.
Oh, yeah, and kelp has those lignans, right? Those are supposed to be really good for you.
You're right. For those who don't know, lignans are these plant compounds that have been linked to all sorts of health benefits.
So kelp is not just a survival food, it's like a health food, too. Man, I'm suddenly feeling the urge to go tide pooling.
Haha, I hear you. But even if you're not near the ocean, there's still plenty to discover closer to home. They also talked about plantain in the Art of Manliness article, but they were careful to point out that it's not the banana-like fruit.
Right, right. Plantain, yeah, I've seen those growing everywhere. What do you do with them?
You can actually eat the leaves, especially when they're young and tender. Good source of vitamin A.
I've spent so much time weeding those out of my garden. Kind of feel silly now.
It happens. We often overlook the most valuable things right under our noses. Now, for something a bit more exotic, the article also touched on prickly pear cactus.
Ooh, those are beautiful. But how do you eat something covered in spines?
Very, very carefully. You have to remove those spines before you can eat the fruit or the pads.
I've had prickly pear fruit before, but I've never tried the pads. What do they taste like?
They have a slightly tart, lemony flavor and a texture kind of like green beans.
Really? Huh, interesting. I'll keep an eye out for those, though I don't know how common prickly pear is outside of, like, desert areas.
Yeah, you're right. They definitely prefer drier climates. But speaking of unusual finds, they finished up with wood sorrel. And this plant actually has a pretty fascinating history.
I think I might have seen that growing in my yard. What's so special about wood sorrel?
Well, the Kiowa people used to chew on it to quench their thirst, and the Cherokee used it medicinally to treat mouth sores.
Wow, so it's edible and medicinal. What do people use it for these days?
The leaves are high in vitamin C, and you can even eat the roots after boiling them.
So to recap, this one article covered everything from common garden weeds to desert cacti, even touched on the historical uses of some plants. That's amazing.
It is, right. Just shows how much knowledge is out there waiting to be rediscovered.
Okay, so we're convinced there's all this amazing stuff out there, but practically speaking, where do we start? What tools do we need? What resources should we be looking at?
Great question. That Foragers Beware blog actually had a lot to say about that. First and foremost, a good field guide is essential. It's like your Bible for identifying plants and understanding their key characteristics.
Any tips for choosing a good field guide? There are so many out there.
Definitely look for one that's specific to your region and make sure it has clear photographs and detailed descriptions. You want to be able to confidently differentiate between edible plants and anything that might look similar but be toxic.
Right, safety first. What else should we pack in our foraging kit?
Sturdy gloves are a must. Thorns, prickles, irritating sap, you name it. Plus, they'll help prevent those pick bites we talked about earlier.
Always a good idea. What about tools for actually, like, harvesting the plants?
Well, that depends on what you're going for. A trowel or a digging knife for roots, maybe some scissors or pruning shears for collecting leaves and flowers, and some containers to carry your finds.
Sounds like I need a bigger backpack. But seriously, I'm getting pretty excited about getting out there and trying this.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it. But before you go charging off into the wilderness, there's one more thing we absolutely have to talk about. Ethical foraging.
Oh, good point. I can imagine this whole foraging thing becoming even more popular as people learn about its benefits. So how do we make sure we're doing it responsibly?
Well, sustainability is key. We never want to over-harvest from an area or damage the plants or their environment.
So basically, leave enough for the plants to regenerate and for other creatures to enjoy, right?
Exactly. And it's also important to remember the role those plants play in the ecosystem. Some are key food sources for wildlife, so we want to avoid harvesting those entirely.
Right. It's all about balance. And of course, being respectful of private property.
Absolutely. Always get permission before foraging on someone else's land, and steer clear of any areas that are clearly marked as off-limits.
Okay, so we've got our field guide, our gloves, our respect for the environment. What's next?
Well, the most important thing is to just keep learning and developing your identification skills. Remember, even with a field guide, it's crucial to pay attention to all of the plant's characteristics, not just the leaves or the flowers.
So things like the stem, the way the leaves are arranged, even the smell can be important clues, huh?
Exactly. And if you're ever unsure about a plant, it's always better to err on the side of caution and leave it alone.
Good advice. I'm realizing this whole foraging thing takes a lot of patience, careful observation, and a willingness to, learn from mistakes.
It does. And speaking of learning, have you ever considered taking a class or joining a local foraging group?
That's a great idea, actually. I bet learning from experienced foragers would be invaluable. Where can people find resources like that?
Lots of places. Nature centers, botanical gardens, even community colleges often offer foraging classes. And you can usually find local foraging groups that meet regularly, do some knowledge sharing, even go on group foraging trips.
Cool. I'll have to look into what's available in my area. But before we move on, I'm just curious, what are some of your personal favorite things to forage for?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm a sucker for wild berries. Always have been. They remind me of summers as a kid, picking berries with my family.
Oh, that's sweet. What about you? Any favorites? I'm really intrigued by all those unusual greens we talked about. I'd love to experiment with things like lamb's quarters and wood sorrel and salads and stir fries.
Those are great choices. Super nutritious and delicious, too. Sounds like you're well on your way to becoming a seasoned forager.
Well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground today, identifying edible plants, using the right tools, a whole ethical harvesting thing.
Yet we've really only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore and learn about this ancient practice. But now it's time to switch gears a bit. In our final segment, we'll dive into some additional considerations, some thought-provoking questions that'll hopefully help you approach foraging with confidence and a deeper appreciation for the natural world.
Okay, so we've talked about identifying plants, the right tools, ethical harvesting, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface, It's like this whole new world has opened up.
That's the thing about foraging. It's a constant exploration. And for this last part, we're going to dive into some deeper questions that might not have easy answers.
Okay, I like where this is going. What kind of questions are we talking about here?
Well, so far we've been mostly focused on wild spaces, right? Forests, fields, coastlines. But what about people who live in cities? Can you really forage in a city?
That's a good question. I've definitely seen dandelions poking up through sidewalk cracks, and we talked about how that Philadelphia Orchard project actually encourages urban foraging.
Right. Those weeds everyone tries to get rid of are often packed with nutrients. Think about parks, community gardens, even your own backyard.
Yeah, but wouldn't you have to worry about pollution and stuff? Like city soil and air can't be that clean, right?
That's a valid concern for sure. You definitely want to be aware of your surroundings, avoid foraging near busy roads or industrial areas where there's a higher risk of contamination.
And what about pesticides? Don't a lot of parks and gardens use those to control pests?
Yeah, that's why it's so important to do your research. Reach out to whoever manages the park or garden. Ask about their pesticide use. Knowledge is power, especially with urban foraging.
So it sounds like urban foraging takes a bit more, detective work, but it's definitely doable. I kind of love the idea of turning the concrete jungle into a foraging ground,
It's like a whole new kind of treasure hunt. Which actually brings up another question we haven't really talked about. The historical side of all this.
Oh, right. Like those goosefoot seeds we were talking about earlier, the ones found in that bog body, evidence of foraging going back thousands of years.
Exactly. And remember, there were even those processed acorns from over 40,000 years ago. Foraging was essential for our ancestors, It was their connection to the land, to the rhythm of the seasons.
So it's like we're, in a way, rediscovering a lost art, a skill that kept humans alive for so long.
Exactly. And with that rediscovery comes a responsibility.
Right.
A responsibility to honor those traditions, to approach foraging with respect and that commitment to sustainability we talked about.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about today.
For sure. From the excitement of identifying these edible plants to the tools, the ethics, we've really done a deep dive into the world of foraging.
But most importantly, we hope we've sparked that curiosity, that sense of wonder about the natural world, and maybe inspired you to try foraging yourself.
Exactly. Remember, foraging is so much more than just gathering food. It's about connecting with nature, realizing that the earth really does provide us with everything we need.
So get out there, explore your surroundings, see what you can find. Happy foraging, everyone.